Every mother knows that gut-wrenching fear when her child is in danger. There's nothing in this world that compares to that moment when you realize you might lose the person you love most. Ana Sanchez felt that terror when floodwaters swept through her riverside town. She had already lost her home and everything she owned, but she held on to one precious thing, a small golden statue of the Virgin Mary her mother left her. When the rushing water carried away her 10-year-old son Miguel, Ana did what any desperate mother would do. She prayed with everything she had left. What happened next changed her life forever and left their small community talking for years to come. But was it really a miracle or just a mother's desperate hope? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of San Gabriel, a riverside town where time moved at the gentle pace of flowing water. Ana Sanchez stepped from her small adobe house, pausing to touch the wooden cross that Roberto had carved, hanging above their kitchen doorway. At 52, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, hands bearing the calluses of 30 years as a seamstress. The Virgin Mary statue sat in its place of honor on the mantelpiece, its golden surface worn smooth by decades of loving touches. Ana's mother, Elena, had carried it from Mexico when she was 18, pregnant and fleeing violence. La Virgin protects those who protect her, Elena had whispered throughout Ana's childhood, especially during the terrible flood of 1987 when Ana was 15. That flood had claimed 12 lives in San Gabriel, but their house stood firm while water raged around it. Ana remembered her mother clutching the statue, praying while the river roared outside. When morning came, their home was untouched, while houses 50 yards away had been swept from their foundations. The neighbors called it luck, but Elena knew better. Miguel's laughter drifted from the backyard where he fed their 3 chickens. At 10, he possessed his father's gentle spirit and his mother's determination. Roberto had died when Miguel was 5, a sudden heart attack that left Ana widowed. But Miguel had been her salvation, his innocent faith pulling her through the darkest months of grief. "Mama, Rosa laid 2 eggs today," Miguel called out. Rosa was his favorite hen, who often perched on his shoulder during homework time. "That's wonderful, Miguel," Ana replied. "We'll have them for breakfast after Mass." Sunday morning in San Gabriel followed comforting patterns generations old. The church bells of San Miguel Archangel rang across the valley, calling the faithful to worship. Father Martinez, 70, with completely white hair, greeted each family at the church entrance with genuine warmth. "Ana, my dear, you look beautiful this morning," he said, taking her hands. "And Miguel, you've grown another inch since last week," Miguel beamed. Father Martinez had been like a grandfather since Roberto's death, offering guidance when Ana felt overwhelmed by single motherhood's challenges. Inside the church, Ana and Miguel took their usual place beneath the stained glass window depicting the Virgin of Guadalupe. Ana held the small statue during prayers, as she did every Sunday. The congregation represented San Gabriel's history, the Hernandez family from the general store, young Morales couple with twin babies, 93-year-old Mrs. Rodriguez with her visiting great-granddaughter. Father Martinez's homily focused on building life's foundation on rock rather than shifting sand. Ana thought of Roberto, whose quiet faith had been their marriage's bedrock. Even dying, he had whispered, "Take care of our boy, and God will take care of you both." After Mass, the community gathered in the courtyard, sharing news and strengthening bonds. Children played among orange trees, while women discussed recipes and men talked about weather concerns. The river had been running higher than usual lately. Ana lingered, watching Miguel discuss soccer plans with friends. Father Martinez joined her, observing the children. "He's becoming quite the young man," the priest said. "Roberto would be proud." Some days I see so much of his father in him, Ana replied softly. Other days I worry I'm not enough. You're raising a good boy with a kind heart and strong faith, Father Martinez assured her. Trust in God's path for you both. Walking home through the plaza, Miguel skipped ahead, petting every animal they encountered. Their house sat 3 blocks from the river, close enough to hear water's constant murmur through open windows. Roberto had chosen the location for that sound, reminiscent of mountain streams from his childhood. Ana's sewing room occupied the house's front, with large windows providing essential natural light. Business had slowed recently as young people traveled to the city for clothes, leaving Ana to serve older residents who valued her traditional skills. The kitchen was their home's heart, dominated by a wooden table where Miguel did homework while Ana cooked. Roberto's hand-carved cross hung above, representing the quiet faith that had guided their marriage. That evening, as Ana prepared dinner with Miguel's collected eggs, she noticed recent changes. The river seemed louder, more insistent. Neighbors mentioned debris floating downstream, suggesting heavy mountain rains. Old-timers remembered 1987 and joked nervously about history repeating. But Ana trusted in the same divine protection that had sheltered them before. After dinner, they sat together, Miguel reading aloud while Ana worked on embroidery for the upcoming feast day. The Virgin Mary statue watched over them, glowing softly in lamplight. These quiet hours were Ana's favorite, when worries faded and she could simply enjoy her son's presence. Before bed, they knelt for nightly prayers, a tradition Ana had inherited and hoped to pass on. Miguel prayed for his chickens, friends, teachers, and Father in heaven, while Ana offered gratitude and requested continued protection. Tucking Miguel into bed, he asked with Roberto's dark eyes, "Mama, do you think Papa can see us from heaven?" Ana smoothed his hair. "I think he sees us every day, Mio. He's proud of what a good boy you're becoming." Later, Ana paused before the Virgin Mary statue for private prayers, thanking the Virgin for daily blessings and requesting guidance in single motherhood's challenges. The statue emanated peace and protection, a constant reminder they weren't alone. Outside, the river sang its ancient song to generations of San Gabriel's residents. Ana fell asleep to that familiar sound, unaware that forces beyond their peaceful valley were gathering strength, bringing a test of faith that would challenge everything she believed about divine protection and a mother's love. The emergency radio crackled to life at 4:30 in the morning, jolting Ana from a deep sleep with its harsh static and urgent voice. She fumbled for the small battery-powered device on her nightstand, a wedding gift from Roberto's brother that had sat unused for years until the power outages during last winter's storms had proven its worth. "This is an emergency bulletin from the National Weather Service," the tinny voice announced through the pre-dawn darkness. "A flash flood warning has been issued for the Rio Grande Valley and all tributaries, including the San Gabriel River Basin. Residents in low-lying areas should prepare for immediate evacuation." Ana's blood ran cold as she processed the words. Flash flood warning. She had heard those words before, during the terrible night in 1987 when she was 15 and the river had claimed so many lives. But this time felt different, more urgent, more threatening. She quickly turned up the volume and listened as the meteorologist explained that an unprecedented storm system in the mountains had dumped nearly 8 inches of rain in just 6 hours, sending massive amounts of water rushing toward the valley. Below, thunder rumbled overhead, closer now than it had been when she went to sleep. Ana could hear the rain intensifying against her windows, driven by winds that made the old house creak and sigh. She slipped into her robe and padded quietly to Miguel's room, where her son was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger approaching their small town. The radio continued its warnings as Ana stood watching Miguel sleep. The river is expected to crest at 15 feet above normal levels within the next 4 hours. All residents within 1 mile of the riverbank must evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. 15 feet above normal. Ana's hands trembled as she calculated what that meant for their neighborhood. Their house sat on slightly higher ground than some of their neighbors, but 15 feet would put water well into their living room, possibly reaching the second floor of the 2-story houses closer to the river. She had to wake Miguel and get them both to safety. "Miguel, Mio, wake up," she whispered, gently shaking his shoulder. "We need to leave the house." Miguel's eyes opened slowly, confused by the unusual hour and his mother's tense expression. "What's wrong, Mama?" "There's going to be flooding, sweetheart. We need to pack some things and go to the community center where it's safe." The community center sat on the highest ground in San Gabriel, a modern concrete building that had been constructed specifically to serve as an emergency shelter after the lessons learned from the 1987 flood. Ana had never imagined she would need to use it, but now she was grateful for the foresight of the town planners who had insisted on its construction. Miguel sat up quickly, suddenly fully awake as the implications sank in. "What about Rosa and the other chickens? What about our house?" Ana's heart ached at the innocent questions that had no good answers. "We'll worry about everything else once we're safe, Mio. Right now, we need to take only what we can carry." She moved through the house with practiced efficiency, gathering essentials into 2 small bags. Clothes for several days, important documents, the small amount of cash she kept hidden in her jewelry box, and medications. Miguel packed his school backpack with some books, a change of clothes, and his most treasured possession, a wooden horse that Roberto had carved for his 5th birthday. The emergency radio continued its urgent broadcasts as they prepared to leave. Reports were coming in from upstream communities that had already been hit by the floodwaters. Bridges were washing out, roads were impassable, and several people were missing. The storm system was being described as a 1,000-year event, the kind of natural disaster that reshaped landscapes and changed lives forever. Ana paused in front of the mantelpiece, looking at the Virgin Mary statue that had protected her family for so many years. The golden figure seemed to glow in the lamplight, its serene expression offering comfort even in the midst of crisis. Without hesitation, Ana wrapped the statue carefully in a kitchen towel and placed it in her bag. If they were going to face this storm, they would face it with the same divine protection that had carried her family through previous trials. "Mama, are you ready?" Miguel asked from the doorway, his backpack secured and his young face showing the first signs of real fear. "Yes, Mio, I'm ready." They stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness, immediately soaked by the driving rain that seemed to come from every direction at once. The wind was stronger than Ana had expected, making it difficult to walk in a straight line as they made their way toward the community center. She could hear the river in the distance. Its voice changed from the gentle murmur she had known all her life to something angrier and more insistent. Other families were making the same journey, their flashlight beams creating moving points of light through the storm. The Hernandez family from the general store passed them in their old pickup truck, the bed loaded with supplies and their elderly grandmother wrapped in blankets in the cab. Mrs. Rodriguez was being helped along the sidewalk by her great-granddaughter, moving slowly but determinedly toward higher ground. The community center was already buzzing with activity when Ana and Miguel arrived. Red Cross volunteers were setting up cots and organizing supplies while Father Martinez moved among the arriving families, offering words of comfort and practical assistance. The building's generator hummed reassuringly, providing electric lights that seemed almost luxurious after the darkness outside. "Ana, Miguel, thank God you're here," Father Martinez said, embracing them both. "I was worried you might not have heard the warnings." "The emergency radio woke us," Ana replied, showing him the small device that continued to broadcast updates. "How bad is it going to be?" Father Martinez's expression was grave. Worse than 1987, I'm afraid. The Weather Service says the river could reach record levels. We're expecting over 200 people to take shelter here before this is over. Ana looked around the large room where families were claiming spaces for their temporary homes. Children clung to their parents, confused by the unusual circumstances and frightened by the adults' obvious worry. Elderly residents sat quietly in folding chairs, their eyes holding the distant look of people who had seen disasters before and knew the pain that was coming. Miguel stayed close to Ana's side as they found a spot near the back wall where they could spread their blankets and settle in for what promised to be a long and difficult night. The Virgin Mary statue sat on the small table beside their cots, its presence providing a focal point for Ana's prayers as the hours passed. The radio reports grew increasingly dire as the night progressed. The river was rising faster than predicted, already reaching levels that were flooding the lower sections of San Gabriel. The old bridge that connected their neighborhood to the rest of the town was reported to be structurally threatened, and emergency vehicles were being positioned on higher ground in case rescue operations became necessary. At dawn, the rain finally began to ease, but the damage was already done. Through the community center's windows, Ana could see muddy water flowing through the streets of her neighborhood, carrying debris from upstream communities and transforming familiar landmarks into an alien landscape. Cars were submerged to there. Rooftops and several smaller houses appeared to be floating like boats in the brown water. Miguel pressed his face against the glass, trying to see their home in the distance. "I can't see our house, Mama. Is it still there?" Ana put her arm around her son, pulling him close as they watched their world disappear beneath the flood. "I don't know, Mio, but we're safe, and that's what matters most." The Virgin Mary statue seemed to catch the morning light streaming through the windows, its golden surface reflecting hope even in the midst of devastation. Ana touched it gently and whispered a prayer of gratitude for their safety, even as her heart broke for everything they might have lost. The flood had come to San Gabriel with a vengeance, but their faith would carry them through whatever trials lay ahead. 3 days had passed since the floodwaters had transformed San Gabriel from a peaceful riverside town into a temporary island surrounded by brown, churning water. The community center had become a small city unto itself, housing nearly 300 residents who had lost their homes or been forced to evacuate from dangerous areas. Ana had discovered that living in close quarters with strangers created both unexpected bonds and occasional tensions that tested everyone's patience. The waterlogged family photo floated past the community center's front window on the second morning, its edges curled and colors bleeding together in the muddy water. Ana recognized it immediately. It was hers, a picture of her, Roberto, and baby Miguel taken just after his first birthday. She had kept it on the kitchen counter, and seeing it drift by like debris was both heartbreaking and oddly liberating, as if the flood was forcing her to let go of material attachments she had clung to since Roberto's death. Miguel had adapted to their temporary circumstances with the resilience that children seemed to possess naturally. He had made friends with the other displaced children and organized games in the community center's gymnasium, turning their shared crisis into an adventure that didn't seem to carry the weight of loss that pressed so heavily on the adults. Ana watched him lead a group of younger children in a game of charades, his natural leadership abilities emerging in ways that reminded her of Roberto's gentle authority. "He's a special boy," said Rosa Martinez, an elderly woman who had claimed the cot next to theirs. Rosa had lived through the 1987 flood as a young mother, and had become an unofficial advisor to the newer residents who had never experienced such devastation. In times like these, you can see the true character of people. Your Miguel has the heart of someone who will take care of others. Ana smiled, grateful for the kind words, even as worry gnawed at her constantly. He gets that from his father. Roberto always said that strength is measured by how much you can carry for other people, not just yourself. The emergency radio continued its steady stream of updates, though the news remained consistently grim. The river was slowly receding, but would take several more days to return to its banks. Search and rescue teams were working around the clock to locate missing persons, and the death toll had risen to 8 confirmed fatalities, with 12 people still unaccounted for. Ana said a silent prayer each time the numbers were announced, grateful that she and Miguel were safe, while her heart ached for the families who were still waiting for news. Father Martinez had established a schedule of services and activities to maintain some sense of normalcy in their temporary community. Morning prayers were held in the center's main room, followed by organized mealtimes and afternoon activities. For the children, Ana found herself drawn into the volunteer efforts, helping to distribute supplies and comfort families who were struggling with the enormity of their losses. The Virgin Mary statue had become something of a focal point for several families seeking spiritual comfort. Ana had placed it on the small table beside their sleeping area, but she noticed that people often paused nearby, some crossing themselves or whispering quiet prayers. She didn't mind the attention. If anything, it reminded her of her mother's words about the statue's purpose being to provide comfort to all who needed it. On the third evening, as Ana knelt beside their cots for the nightly prayers she had maintained despite their unusual circumstances, Miguel's questions revealed the depth of his processing about their situation. "Mama, why do you think God let this happen to us?" he asked, his voice small in the darkened room where dozens of families were settling in for another night away from home. Ana considered her words carefully, knowing that her answer would shape Miguel's understanding of faith during one of the most challenging experiences of his young life. "I don't think God caused the flood, Mio. Sometimes bad things happen because we live in a world where storms and rivers and earthquakes are part of nature. But I believe God is with us in the difficult times, giving us strength and bringing people together to help each other." Miguel was quiet for a moment, processing her explanation, like how Mrs. Martinez shared her medicine with the baby who was sick, and how Mr. Hernandez gave us extra blankets even though his family needed them too. "Exactly like that," Ana replied, her heart swelling with pride at her son's ability to see goodness even in their circumstances. "When people help each other during hard times, I think that's how God's love shows up in the world." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the front of the center. A rescue team had arrived with a family they had pulled from the roof of their house, including an elderly man who appeared to be suffering from exposure and dehydration. Ana watched as the entire community mobilized to help people, sharing clothes, food, and medicine, making room for the new arrivals despite the already crowded conditions. Father Martinez appeared at the newcomers' side immediately, offering both practical assistance and spiritual comfort. Ana was struck by how naturally he moved between roles, one moment helping to distribute dry clothes, the next offering last rites to the elderly man who had been weakened by his ordeal. His presence seemed to remind everyone that they were not just refugees taking shelter, but a community of faith supporting each other through crisis. As the evening settled into the quiet rhythms they had established over the past 3 days, Ana found herself thinking about the photo she had seen floating by that morning. It had contained one of her favorite memories, Roberto holding baby Miguel, while all 3 of them laughed at something Miguel had done. The photo was gone now, dissolved into the floodwater, but the memory remained intact, and perhaps even more precious for having survived when its physical representation had not. Miguel fell asleep quickly, exhausted by another day of helping with the younger children and adapting to their temporary circumstances. Ana sat beside his cot for a while, listening to the gentle breathing of dozens of families and the continuing rain that drummed softly against the building's roof. The Virgin Mary statue caught the light from the emergency lanterns that provided their only illumination, its golden surface warm and reassuring in the dim light. Around her, the community center held the quiet sounds of people adapting to extraordinary circumstances. Babies fussed and were comforted. Elderly residents shifted in their cots, seeking comfortable positions. And occasionally, someone would get up to use the facilities or check on a family member. It was a symphony of human resilience, playing out in whispered conversations and gentle movements that spoke to the fundamental strength that emerges when people face disaster together. Aina touched the Virgin Mary statue gently before settling into her own narrow cot. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began to assess the damage to their homes and possessions. But tonight she felt surrounded by the same sense of protection that had carried her family through previous trials. The flood had taken much from San Gabriel, but it had also revealed the strength of the community and the depth of faith that would carry them through whatever rebuilding lay ahead. The floodwaters had finally receded enough for residents to begin returning to survey the damage to their homes and neighborhoods. Aina's hands shook as she and Miguel approached their street, prepared for the worst, but hoping for some small miracle that might have preserved the peace of their former life. The mud-covered soccer ball that emerged from a pile of debris near their front gate was the first sign that Miguel's childhood had been forever altered by the flood's destructive power. Miguel ran to the ball immediately, brushing away the thick layer of silt that covered its familiar black and white pattern. It was the same ball Roberto had given him for his 8th birthday, the one they had kicked around their small backyard countless times during the lazy summer evenings before Roberto's death. Now it seemed like an artifact from another lifetime, a reminder of innocence that felt impossibly distant from their current reality. "Look, Mama, it's still here," Miguel said, his voice containing a mixture of joy and uncertainty. He attempted to bounce the ball, but the waterlogged leather had lost its elasticity, producing only a dull thud against the muddy ground. Aina's throat tightened as she watched her son try to reclaim some piece of normalcy from the devastation around them. Their house still stood, but the brown water line that reached nearly to the windows told the story of how high the flood had risen. Everything on the ground floor would be ruined: her sewing machines, their furniture, the kitchen where they had shared so many meals, even the hand-carved cross that had watched over their family table. The front door hung open, swollen from the water and no longer fitting properly in its frame. Aina stepped carefully through the threshold, Miguel close behind her, both of them navigating around the thick layer of mud and debris that covered everything. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of river water, decay, and the peculiar odor that comes from lives interrupted and possessions destroyed. Miguel's drawings from school, carefully displayed on the refrigerator, had been transformed into papier-mache sculptures of unrecognizable shapes. The couch where they had spent countless evenings reading together was now a sodden mass that would need to be dragged outside and abandoned. Aina's sewing machine, the reliable singer that had supported their family for 15 years, sat silent and useless beneath a coating of mud so thick it obscured the brand name on its side. "Can't we fix it?" Miguel asked, referring to everything and nothing at the same time. Aina looked around their ruined home, calculating the overwhelming scope of what would need to be replaced, repaired, or simply accepted as lost forever. The practical side of her mind began making lists: contact insurance, find temporary housing, salvage what could be salvaged. But her heart was breaking for the life they had built so carefully and lost so quickly. "Some things we can fix. Some things we'll have to replace, and some things we'll just have to remember," she said, choosing her words carefully. "The important thing is that we're both safe and healthy." They made their way upstairs, where the damage was less severe, but still significant. Water stains marked the walls where humidity had penetrated, and several of Miguel's books had been damaged by roof leaks during the storm. But his bed was intact, and the wooden horse that Roberto had carved sat safely on the dresser where Miguel had left it before their evacuation. Aina moved to her bedroom, where she had hoped to find some of Roberto's belongings that might have survived the flood. His toolbox was ruined, the carefully maintained instruments of his carpentry trade now twisted and rusty. But in the top drawer of their dresser, wrapped in an old tie-shirt, she found their wedding rings. Roberto's had been too large for her finger, so she had kept it with her own engagement ring in a small jewelry box that had somehow stayed dry. The Virgin Mary statue waited patiently in her bag, and Aina placed it carefully on the windowsill where it could overlook their damaged neighborhood. From that vantage point, the statue seemed to survey the work that lay ahead with the same serene confidence it had always displayed, as if floods and disasters were simply temporary interruptions in a longer story of faith and perseverance. Miguel had found several of his toys that had survived on higher shelves, and he arranged them carefully on his bed, as if recreating a familiar world in miniature. Aina watched him work, marveling at his ability to find hope and order in the midst of chaos. Children possessed a resilience that adults often lost along the way, an ability to adapt and rebuild that might be humanity's greatest strength. Outside, they could see their neighbors engaged in similar assessments of loss and survival. The Hernandez family was loading ruined merchandise from their store into a truck, their faces grim but determined. Mrs. Rodriguez sat on her front steps. Surrounded by photo albums she was carefully separating and hanging on a clothesline to dry, preserving what memory she could from the flood's destruction. The afternoon sun was warm as Aina and Miguel worked together to salvage what they could from their damaged home. They found clothes that could be washed, books that might be saved if dried properly, and small treasures that had somehow escaped the flood's reach. Each rescued item felt like a small victory, proof that not everything had been lost to the muddy water that had invaded their sanctuary. Miguel's soccer ball became a symbol of their determination to rebuild. Though it no longer bounced properly, he carried it with him as they worked, occasionally attempting to kick it despite its waterlogged condition. Aina understood that the ball represented more than just a toy. It was Miguel's connection to the Father who had given it to him and the childhood that was now forever divided into before and after the flood. As evening approached, they prepared to return to the community center for another night of temporary shelter. Aina took one last look around their damaged home, offering a silent prayer of gratitude that the structure had survived and a request for strength to face the enormous task of rebuilding that lay ahead. The Virgin Mary statue traveled back to the community center in Aina's bag, ready to resume its role as a source of comfort and hope in their temporary circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new decisions about how to reconstruct their lives, but tonight Aina felt a quiet confidence that they would find a way forward, guided by the same faith that had sustained her family through every previous trial. 2 weeks after the flood, Aina stood in what had once been her sewing room, staring at the rusted remains of her singer machine that she and Miguel had managed to extract from the dried mud. The sewing machine had been more than just a tool for earning income. It had been her connection to her mother's legacy, the instrument through which she had created beauty and provided for her family. Now it sat before her like a broken promise, its intricate mechanism seized with rust and sediment that no amount of cleaning could repair. Aina ran her fingers along the machine's familiar curves, remembering the countless hours she had spent guiding fabric through its precise stitches. She had learned to sew on this very machine when she was Miguel's age, standing on a wooden stool so she could reach the pedals while her mother guided her hands. Elena had taught her that sewing was more than just joining pieces of cloth. It was about creating something whole and beautiful from separate parts, about patience and precision and the quiet satisfaction of work done well. Miguel appeared in the doorway of the temporary trailer that FEMA had provided for their housing while they rebuilt. The small aluminum structure sat in what had been their backyard, connected to temporary utilities and furnished with the basic necessities of life. It was clean and functional, but it felt nothing like home. And Ana could see in Miguel's eyes that he was struggling with the displacement as much as she was. "The insurance man is here again," Miguel announced, his voice carrying the weariness of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Over the past 2 weeks, they had dealt with a parade of adjusters, contractors and officials, each requiring forms and explanations and decisions that felt overwhelming in their scope and complexity. Ana sighed and covered the sewing machine with a tarp, knowing she would need to make a decision about its fate soon. The insurance settlement would cover some of their losses, but it wouldn't be enough to replace everything they had lost, and certainly not enough to restore the sense of security and continuity that had been swept away with the floodwater. The insurance adjuster was a kind man in his 50s who had clearly dealt with many flood victims over the years. He explained the settlement offer with gentle patience, but the numbers he quoted fell far short of what Ana would need to truly rebuild their life. The policy covered the structure of the house and some of their possessions, but it couldn't replace the years of building a business or the intangible sense of belonging that came from living in the same place for decades. Miguel sat quietly at the small table in their temporary kitchen, working on homework that seemed almost surreal in their current circumstances. His teacher had been understanding about his situation, but Ana could see that he was falling behind academically and struggling to concentrate on lessons when their entire world had been turned upside down. He had started having nightmares about water, waking up in the middle of the night calling for her and needing reassurance that they were safe on dry ground. "Mrs. Sanchez," the adjuster said as he prepared to leave, "I know this is difficult, but you might want to consider whether rebuilding here is the right choice. The river has changed its pattern, and there's no guarantee this won't happen again." Ana thanked him for his advice, but knew in her heart that leaving San Gabriel wasn't an option. This was where Roberto was buried, where her mother had raised her, where her roots ran deeper than any floodwater could reach. They would rebuild here, even if it meant starting over with less than they had hoped. That evening, Ana sat in their cramped temporary quarters, trying to plan their future while Miguel played quietly with the few toys they had managed to salvage. The Virgin Mary statue sat on the small shelf above their temporary sink, its presence providing continuity between their old life and whatever came next. Ana found herself having longer conversations with the statue lately, sharing her fears and doubts in whispered prayers that seemed to ease the weight of decision-making that pressed on her constantly. Father Martinez visited that night, as he had several times since the flood, bringing both spiritual comfort and practical assistance. The church had established a fund to help flood victims, and he had been coordinating donations and volunteer labor to help families rebuild. His presence always brought Ana a sense of peace, reminding her that she and Miguel were part of a larger community that would support them through this difficult time. "You look tired, my dear," Father Martinez observed as he accepted a cup of coffee and settled into one of their temporary chairs. "Are you sleeping?" Ana shook her head. "Too much to think about, too many decisions to make. Sometimes I lie awake wondering if I'm strong enough to handle all of this on my own." "Strength isn't about handling everything perfectly," Father Martinez replied. "It's about having the courage to ask for help when you need it, and the faith to keep moving forward even when the path isn't clear." Miguel looked up from his homework, having overheard their conversation. "Mama, are we going to be poor now?" The innocent question cut straight to Ana's deepest fears. They weren't poor in the traditional sense. They had insurance money, temporary housing, and the promise of assistance from various relief organizations. But they had lost the financial security that came from having an established business and a paid-off home. Starting over at 52 felt overwhelming in ways that Ana hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. "We're going to have less money than before," Ana answered honestly. "But we have each other, and we have people who care about us. Poor is when you don't have hope, and we have plenty of that." Miguel seemed satisfied with her answer and returned to his homework. But Ana caught Father Martinez watching her with the concerned expression of someone who recognized the weight she was carrying. After Miguel went to bed, they talked quietly about her fears and the practical challenges of rebuilding both her home and her business in a community that was struggling with its own recovery. "The sewing machine can be replaced," Father Martinez said gently, "but your skill and reputation can't be destroyed by any flood. People will always need the work you do, Ana. Trust in that, and trust in the community that values what you offer." Ana nodded, grateful for his wisdom and support, but still feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of starting over. As she prepared for bed in their temporary quarters, she offered her nightly prayers to the Virgin Mary statue, asking for guidance and strength to make the right decisions for herself and Miguel. Outside, she could hear the river flowing past, its voice no longer the gentle lullaby she had known all her life, but something more insistent and unpredictable that reminded her daily of how quickly everything could change. 1 month after the flood, Ana knelt in the muddy remnants of what had once been her mother's garden, her fingers searching through the debris-laden soil for any sign of the plants Elena had cultivated with such care. The rosary beads emerged from the earth like a small miracle, their silver chain tarnished and several beads missing, but the small crucifix still intact, despite being buried under layers of flood sediment. Ana recognized them immediately. They had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women who had prayed over their smooth surfaces during times of joy and sorrow. The discovery of the damaged rosary felt like a message from her mother, a reminder that faith could survive even when it appeared broken or incomplete. Ana cleaned the beads carefully with water from their temporary outdoor spigot, counting the remaining ones and noting where the missing pieces had created gaps in the familiar pattern. Like their lives since the flood, the rosary was functional but changed, requiring new ways of moving through familiar prayers. Miguel had grown increasingly difficult in recent weeks, his behavior swinging between defiant independence and clingy neediness that left Ana feeling inadequate as a parent. The trauma of the flood was manifesting in ways she didn't fully understand, and her attempts to provide comfort and structure often seemed to make things worse. That morning, he had refused to go to the temporary school that had been set up in the church basement, claiming his stomach hurt, though Ana suspected his resistance was more emotional than physical. "I don't want to go to this stupid school," Miguel had declared over breakfast, his arms crossed and his face set in a stubborn expression that reminded Ana so much of Roberto when he was determined about something. "All they talk about is the flood, and I'm tired of talking about the flood." Ana understood his frustration more than she could express. The entire community seemed trapped in a perpetual state of processing their collective trauma, with every conversation eventually returning to losses in recovery plans and the long road ahead. But Miguel needed education and routine, and she couldn't allow his resistance to disrupt the small amount of normalcy they were trying to rebuild. "You still have to go to school, Mia," she had replied firmly. "Learning is important, especially now when everything else is changing." Miguel's response had been to storm out of their temporary trailer, heading toward the river with the kind of reckless determination that made Ana's heart race with fear. She had followed him, calling his name and pleading with him to come back, but he had ignored her completely until she physically caught up with him and took his hand to lead him back to safety. Now, as she knelt in the garden with the recovered rosary beads in her palm, Ana felt the weight of single parenthood pressing down on her with renewed intensity. Roberto would have known how to handle Miguel's acting out, would have provided the kind of firm but gentle guidance that seemed to come naturally to fathers. Ana felt like she was guessing her way through each day, hoping her decisions were right, but never feeling confident about her approach. Father Martinez had suggested counseling for Miguel, connecting her with a social worker who specialized in childhood trauma. But Aina found herself resistant to the idea of outside intervention. She had been raised to believe that family problems should be solved within the family, with faith and prayer providing the guidance needed to work through difficulties. The idea of discussing their private struggles with a stranger felt like an admission of failure, evidence that her faith wasn't strong enough to carry them through this crisis. Other parents in the community were dealing with similar challenges. Maria Hernandez had mentioned that her daughter was having nightmares and refusing to sleep alone, while Carlos Rodriguez reported that his teenage son had become withdrawn and angry, spending hours staring at the river with an intensity that worried his family. The flood had affected the children in ways that were only beginning to emerge, and none of the parents seemed to have clear answers about how to help their kids process such overwhelming experiences. Aina's own isolation was becoming more pronounced. As the weeks passed, many of her neighbors were dealing with their own recovery challenges, and the easy social connections that had defined life in San Gabriel before the flood were strained by the practical demands of rebuilding. She spent long hours alone in their temporary trailer, working on hand-sewing projects that provided some income, but reminded her constantly of everything she had lost with her business. The Virgin Mary statue had become her primary confidant. During these lonely hours, receiving the full weight of Aina's fears and doubts in whispered conversations that she couldn't share with anyone else. She worried that she was failing Miguel, that her own grief and stress were preventing her from being the mother he needed during this critical time. She second-guessed every decision, from small daily choices about meals and bedtime to larger questions about whether to rebuild their house or relocate to a safer area. Miguel's fascination with the river had become a source of constant anxiety for Aina. Despite her repeated warnings about the dangers of fast-moving water and unstable banks, he seemed drawn to the water's edge like a moth to flame. She had found him there twice in the past week, sitting on a fallen log and staring at the current with an intensity that frightened her. When she asked what he was thinking about during these river visits, he would shrug and say he was just watching. But Aina sensed there was something deeper happening in his young mind. The evening brought another confrontation when Miguel announced that he was going to sleep outside in their damaged house rather than in the cramped trailer. Aina's patience finally snapped, leading to an argument that revealed the depth of frustration they were both carrying. "You can't sleep in that house, Miguel. It's not safe and is not healthy," Aina said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "I don't care," Miguel shot back, his 10-year-old voice cracking with emotion. "I hate living in this stupid trailer, and I hate that our house is broken, and I hate that Papa isn't here to fix everything." The raw pain in his words broke Aina's heart, but also helped her understand that his defiance wasn't really about the house or the school, or even the river. It was about the overwhelming sense of loss and powerlessness that they were both struggling to process. Miguel was trying to exert control over something, anything, in a world that had proven how quickly everything could be taken away. Aina knelt down to Miguel's eye level, the damaged rosary beads still clutched in her hand. "I know you're angry and scared, Mio. I'm angry and scared too. But we have to take care of each other, and that means making safe choices, even when we don't like our circumstances." Miguel's defiance crumbled into tears, and Aina pulled him into her arms, holding him while he sobbed out weeks of accumulated fear and frustration. They sat together on the steps of their temporary trailer, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Both of them exhausted by the emotional intensity of their struggle to rebuild not just their physical home but their sense of security and connection to each other. That night, as Miguel finally slept peacefully in his narrow trailer bed, Aina sat with the recovered rosary beads and tried to pray despite feeling disconnected from the comfort that faith had always provided. The missing beads created awkward pauses in the familiar rhythm of the Hail Marys, forcing her to adapt the prayer to accommodate the gaps, just as she was learning to adapt every aspect of their life to accommodate their losses. The Virgin Mary statue seemed to watch over them with the same serene expression it had always worn. But Aina found herself questioning whether divine protection was real or simply a comforting illusion that helped people cope with circumstances beyond their control. The flood had tested her faith in ways she hadn't expected, not by making her doubt God's existence, but by forcing her to confront the possibility that prayer might not be enough to protect the people she loved from life's hardest trials. 6 weeks after the flood, Aina discovered Miguel's wet shoes by the front door of their temporary trailer. The canvas fabric soaked through and caked with the distinctive red clay that marked the riverbank's most dangerous section. Her blood ran cold as she picked up the small sneakers, feeling the weight of water still trapped in their soles and recognizing the smell of river water that brought back memories of that terrible night when San Gabriel had nearly been swept away. Miguel was supposed to be at the temporary school, safe in the church basement with his classmates and teachers, not wandering along the swollen river that still ran higher and faster than normal. Aina's hands trembled as she set the shoes down and called for him throughout their small temporary quarters, hoping against hope that he was simply hiding somewhere nearby rather than continuing whatever dangerous activity had left his shoes so thoroughly soaked. "Miguel," she called out, her voice carrying the edge of panic that she tried to keep hidden during their daily struggles. "Miguel, where are you?" The silence that answered her was more frightening than any sound could have been. Aina grabbed her jacket and headed toward the river, following the muddy footprints that led from their temporary housing area toward the water's edge. Each step increased her anxiety as she recognized the path Miguel had been taking during his unauthorized visits to the river, a route that led directly to the section where the current was strongest and the banks most unstable. She found Miguel sitting on a fallen tree that extended partway into the rushing water, his bare feet dangling just inches above the surface while he stared intently at something in the current. He was completely absorbed in whatever had captured his attention, oblivious to the danger of his position or his mother's approach until Aina called his name from the muddy bank. "Miguel Sanchez, get away from that water right now," Aina commanded, her voice carrying all the authority and fear that had been building for weeks. Miguel startled at the sound of his full name spoken in that tone, but instead of immediately obeying, he turned to face her with an expression of defiance that Aina had never seen before. His dark eyes held a mixture of anger and determination that reminded her of Roberto in his most stubborn moments. But this was different, this was reckless in a way that terrified her. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Miguel said, his voice carrying a challenge that made Aina's heart sink. "I'm just watching the water. You're supposed to be in school, and you're definitely not supposed to be anywhere near this river," Aina replied, stepping carefully onto the muddy bank. "Come down from there immediately." Miguel's response shocked her with its intensity. "I don't want to go to that stupid school anymore, and I don't want to live in that stupid trailer. And I don't want to pretend that everything is okay when it's not." The raw emotion in his voice stopped Aina in her tracks. She could see tears streaming down his face, and suddenly his defiance made terrible sense. Miguel wasn't just being reckless. He was expressing the same grief and anger that she had been struggling to contain in herself. The difference was that he was 10 years old and didn't have the emotional tools to process such overwhelming feelings safely. "Miguel, please come down so we can talk about this," Aina said, softening her tone and extending her hand toward him. "I know you're upset, but sitting over dangerous water isn't going to help anything. Papa used to bring me here," Miguel said, his voice breaking. "He taught me how to skip stones right here, and he told me that the river was our friend. But then the river took away our house and all our things, and Papa isn't here to explain why it happened." Ana's heart broke as she finally understood what had been driving Miguel's behavior. He had been coming to the river not out of recklessness, but out of a desperate need to feel connected to his father's memory. The water that had destroyed their life was also the place where he had shared some of his happiest moments with Roberto, and his 10-year-old mind was struggling to reconcile those contradictory realities. "Your papa did love this river," Ana said carefully, moving closer to the fallen tree. "But he also respected how dangerous it could be. He would never want you to put yourself at risk, especially not when the water is running this high and fast." Miguel wiped his nose with the back of his hand, his defiance beginning to crumble into the grief that had been driving it. "I just miss him so much, Mama. And sometimes when I sit here, I can almost remember what it felt like when he was still with us." Ana felt her own tears starting as she recognized the depth of pain her son had been carrying alone. In her focus on the practical challenges of rebuilding their life, she had failed to realize how much Miguel was struggling with the emotional impact of reliving loss through the flood. The disaster had reopened wounds from Roberto's death that had never fully healed, and Miguel had been trying to process that pain in the only way he knew how. "I miss him too, Mayo," Ana said, finally reaching the fallen tree and extending her hand again, every single day. "But he wouldn't want us to put ourselves in danger because we're sad. He would want us to take care of each other and be smart about staying safe." Miguel looked at her outstretched hand, then at the rushing water below his feet, and Ana could see him weighing his options. For a moment, she was terrified that he might jump into the current rather than face the difficult conversation that was coming. But then he scooted carefully along the tree trunk toward shore, accepting her help to climb down safely onto the muddy bank. They stood together beside the river, both of them crying now, while Ana tried to figure out how to address the deeper issues that Miguel's behavior had revealed. His grief over Roberto's death had been complicated by the trauma of the flood, creating a complex emotional situation that required more understanding and support than she had been providing. "Miguel, we need to talk about what you've been feeling since the flood," Ana said, putting her arm around his small shoulders. "And we need to find better ways for you to remember Papa that don't put you in danger." Miguel nodded against her side, his defiance finally giving way to the vulnerability he had been hiding for weeks. "I thought if I was brave enough to sit by the water, maybe I could understand why bad things happen to good people. Papa always said brave people don't let anything scare them." Ana's heart ached as she realized how Miguel had misunderstood his father's teachings about courage. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared, Mio. It means being scared but making good choices anyway. Your papa was scared of lots of things, but he was brave because he always tried to protect the people he loved." As they walked back toward their temporary housing, Ana knew that this conversation was just the beginning of addressing the complex emotional challenges that Miguel was facing. The wet shoes had revealed not just disobedience, but a depth of grief and confusion that would require patience, understanding, and possibly professional help to resolve properly. The flood had taken more than their possessions. It had reopened wounds and created new traumas that would take time and care to heal. The flashlight's beam cut through the gathering darkness as Ana searched frantically along the riverbank, calling Miguel's name into the evening air that carried only the sound of rushing water and her own echoing voice. 2 hours had passed since she had discovered he was missing from their temporary trailer. 2 hours during which her imagination had conjured every possible disaster that could befall a 10-year-old boy who had been drawn repeatedly to the river's dangerous edge. Ana had checked everywhere she could think of the damaged remains of their house, the community center where some families still gathered in the evenings, the temporary school building, even the homes of Miguel's few remaining friends whose families hadn't relocated after the flood. No one had seen him since late afternoon, when Mrs. Hernandez had noticed him walking toward the river with what she described as that determined look that worried mothers recognize. The flashlight had been a gift from the Red Cross volunteers, a practical tool for navigating their temporary living situation, but now it felt like her only connection to hope as she swept its beam across the muddy banks and debris-scattered shoreline. Every shadow could be Miguel. Every sound could be his voice calling for help. And every passing minute increased the likelihood that something terrible had happened to the child who meant everything to her. Father Martinez had organized a search party within an hour of Ana's frantic call to the church. Now a dozen community members spread out along different sections of the river, their own flashlights creating moving points of light in the darkness while they called Miguel's name and checked every possible hiding place. The priest himself had taken the most dangerous section downstream, where the current was strongest and the chances of survival lowest if someone fell into the water. Ana's mind raced through the conversation she and Miguel had shared that afternoon, searching for clues about his mental state that might help predict where he had gone. Since their confrontation by the river 6 weeks ago, their relationship had been strained by her increased vigilance and his growing resentment of the restrictions she had placed on his movements. She had thought they were making progress, but now she wondered if his apparent cooperation had simply been better concealment of his continuing need to seek connection with his father's memory through proximity to the water. These search parties. Radios crackled with regular check-ins, but each report brought the same disappointing news. No sign of Miguel in any of the obvious locations. Ana's fear deepened with each negative report, especially when Carlos Rodriguez radioed that he had found fresh footprints leading to the most treacherous section of the riverbank, where recent erosion had created unstable overhangs that could collapse without warning. Ana's flashlight illuminated the muddy ground as she followed the trail of small footprints that led directly toward the water's edge. Her heart pounded as she recognized Miguel's distinctive sneaker pattern pressed into the soft earth, accompanied by the round impressions that indicated he had been carrying something heavy. She called his name more urgently now, her voice carrying the desperation of a mother who could feel disaster approaching but was powerless to prevent it. The memories of Roberto's death came flooding back as Ana searched in the darkness, reminding her of another night when she had felt this same overwhelming helplessness in the face of losing someone she loved. Roberto's heart attack had been sudden and unexpected, giving her no opportunity to say goodbye or take any action that might have changed the outcome. The possibility of losing Miguel felt like a repetition of that horrible powerlessness. But this time, there might still be a chance to find him before it was too late. Father Martinez's voice reached her through the darkness as he called out from downstream. "Ana, I found something. Come quickly, but be careful on this bank." Ana's legs felt weak as she made her way toward the priest's voice, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as her hand shook with fear. She found Father Martinez kneeling beside a familiar object half buried in the muddy shore, Miguel's waterlogged soccer ball, the same one he had rescued from their flooded home and carried with him as a symbol of happier times with his father. "This doesn't necessarily mean he's in the water," Father Martinez said quickly, seeing the panic in Ana's eyes. "He could have thrown it in, or it could have washed here from somewhere else. We need to keep searching." But Ana knew with a mother's intuition that Miguel was nearby, that his presence by the dangerous water was connected to the soccer ball that represented so much of his relationship with Roberto. She followed the beam of her flashlight along the water's edge, calling his name with increasing urgency while the sound of the current seemed to grow louder and more threatening in the darkness. The Virgin Mary statue pressed against her side where she had placed it in her jacket pocket, its familiar weight providing a small measure of comfort in the midst of her terror. Ana found herself praying with an intensity she had never experienced before, offering bargains and promises to God if only Miguel could be found safe and unharmed. The statue seemed to grow warmer against her body, as if responding to the depth of her desperation with some kind of divine presence. "Miguel," she called again, her voice cracking with emotion. "Miguel, please answer me. I'm not angry. I just want to know you're safe." A faint sound reached her through the darkness. Something that might have been a voice or might have been the water playing tricks on her desperate mind. Anna stopped moving and held her breath, straining to hear any sound that might indicate Miguel's location. The flashlight beam swept across the water's surface, reflecting off the dark current that moved with hypnotic power toward the valley below. Then she saw him, a small figure crouched on a partially submerged log that extended into the river's main channel, his back turned toward shore as he stared intently at something in the fast-moving water. Miguel appeared to be talking to himself, or singing, his voice too low for Anna to make out the words, but clearly audible above the sound of the current. "Miguel," Anna called out, her relief at finding him alive immediately replaced by terror at his precarious position. The log he was sitting on was barely above the water level, and the current was strong enough to sweep away much larger objects. One slip, one moment of lost balance, and he would be carried downstream into water too deep and fast for any rescue attempt. Miguel turned at the sound of his name, and Anna could see in her flashlight beam that he had been crying. His face was streaked with tears and mud, and his eyes held the same lost expression she had seen in the mirror during the darkest days after Roberto's death. He wasn't being defiant this time. He was seeking something in the water that he desperately needed, but couldn't name or understand. "I was trying to give Papa his ball back," Miguel called out, his voice small and broken. "I thought if I put it in the water where he used to play with me, maybe he would know that I still remember all the games we played together." Anna's heart shattered as she understood the innocent logic that had led her son into such danger. Miguel wasn't being reckless. He was trying to honor his father's memory in the only way his 10-year-old mind could conceive. The soccer ball had been his offering, his attempt to bridge the gap between the living and the dead through the medium of the water that had shaped so much of their family's history. "That's a beautiful way to remember Papa," Anna said, fighting to keep her voice calm despite her terror. "But he would want you to be safe more than anything else. Can you come back to shore so we can find a safer way to honor his memory?" Miguel looked down at the dark water rushing beneath the log, then back at Anna standing on the muddy bank. For a moment, she was terrified that he might choose to throw himself into the current, rather than face the grief that had driven him to this desperate gesture. But then he began to scoot carefully along the log toward shore, moving slowly and deliberately while Anna held her breath and prayed with every fiber of her being for his safe return to solid ground. The broken tree branch jutted from the riverbank like an outstretched arm, its thick trunk providing Anna's only hope of stability as she fought against the current that had swept both her and Miguel into its relentless embrace. The moment Miguel had lost his footing on the slippery log, Anna hadn't hesitated. She had plunged into the dangerous water without thought for her own safety, driven by the primal instinct that her child's life was worth any risk she might face. Now they were both trapped in the river's grasp, carried downstream by water that was far stronger and colder than Anna had imagined. Miguel's small body was limp in her arms, his face pale and still in the flashlight beam that someone on shore was directing toward them. Anna couldn't tell if he was breathing, couldn't determine if her desperate dive into the water had saved him, or simply ensured that they would both be claimed by the same current that had already taken so much from their community. Anna's lungs burned as she struggled to keep both their heads above water while fighting toward the sturdy branch that represented their only chance of survival. Her clothes were waterlogged and heavy, dragging her down despite her desperate efforts to stay afloat. The Virgin Mary statue was still pressed against her side in her jacket pocket, its weight both comforting and problematic as she needed every advantage she could get to reach safety. The current was stronger than anything Anna had ever experienced. a living force that seemed determined to carry them away from the searching voices on shore and toward the deeper, faster water downstream. She could hear Father Martinez calling instructions, other community members shouting encouragement, but their voices seemed to come from another world as she focused all her energy on keeping Miguel's face above the surface while struggling toward the branch. Miguel's body was completely slack in her arms, showing no signs of consciousness or voluntary movement. Ana couldn't tell if he had hit his head when he fell from the log, or if he was simply overwhelmed by the shock of the cold water and the terror of being swept away. Either way, she was carrying dead weight while fighting a current that challenged even her desperate determination to save her son's life. The tree branch was less than 10 feet away, but those feet felt like miles as Ana battled the water that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Her shoulders ached from the effort of keeping Miguel afloat, and her legs were cramping from the constant motion required to fight the current's pull. She could feel her strength beginning to fail, could sense that she might not have enough energy left to reach the safety that was so tantalizingly close. Ana's grip on Miguel shifted as she made one final, desperate push toward the branch. Her fingertips brushed against the rough bark, but the current pulled him away before she could establish a firm hold. Panic flooded through her as she realized they might be swept past their only chance of rescue, carried into the deeper water where no one would be able to reach them in time. With a strength born of pure desperation, Ana managed to catch the branch on her second attempt, her fingers wrapping around the solid wood with a grip that nothing could break. The sudden stop jarred both her and Miguel, but it also gave her the platform she needed to assess their situation and begin the process of getting them both out of the deadly water. Miguel remained unconscious in her arms, his breathing so shallow that Ana couldn't detect it over the sound of the rushing current. His lips were turning blue from cold and oxygen deprivation, and his small body felt increasingly lifeless despite Ana's efforts to keep him warm and secure. The sight of her son so still and pale triggered something primal in Ana's heart, a desperation that went beyond anything she had ever experienced. Holding the branch with one arm while supporting Miguel with the other, Ana found herself praying with an intensity that seemed to come from the very core of her being. The Virgin Mary statue pressed against her ribs, its presence somehow more tangible than it had been before, as if the small golden figure was responding to the depth of her need with some kind of divine intervention. "Please," Ana whispered, through chattering teeth, addressing both the Virgin Mary and whatever divine force might be listening to a mother's desperate plea. "Please don't take him from me. I'll do anything, give anything, believe anything you want me to believe. Just please let my son live." The water continued to rush around them, cold and relentless, while Ana clung to the branch and prayed with everything she had left. She could hear the search party on shore getting closer, could see their flashlight beams growing brighter, but Miguel's stillness terrified her more than the dangerous current or her own exhaustion. In that moment, suspended between life and death in the rushing water, Ana offered her complete surrender to whatever divine will might determine their fate. Through the storm clouds that had gathered overhead, a vision of the Virgin Mary appeared with such clarity and radiance that Ana questioned whether she was witnessing a miracle or hallucinating from exhaustion and terror. The divine figure materialized in the swirling darkness above the river, her traditional blue robes flowing as if moved by celestial wind, her serene face gazing down at Ana and Miguel with infinite compassion and understanding. The vision was unlike anything Ana had ever experienced or imagined, not the static representation from paintings or statues, but a living presence that seemed to emanate peace and power in equal measure. The Virgin's eyes met Ana's across the distance between heaven and earth, and in that moment of contact, Ana felt a warmth spread through her body despite the cold water that surrounded them. The appearance lasted only seconds, but those seconds contained an eternity of communication that transcended words or rational explanation. Aina felt her own desperation transformed into something approaching peace, her frantic prayers replaced by a quiet confidence that divine intervention was not just possible, but actively occurring in that moment above the rushing river. As if responding to some unseen signal, Miguel's body suddenly convulsed in Aina's arms, water erupting from his lungs in violent spasms. That brought him back to consciousness with a gasp that was the most beautiful sound Aina had ever heard. His eyes opened wide with confusion and terror, but they were alive and alert, focusing on his mother's face with recognition and relief. "Mama," Miguel whispered, his voice weak but unmistakably present. "What happened? Why are we in the water?" Aina's tears mixed with the river water streaming down her face as she held Miguel close, feeling his breathing return to normal and his body regain its strength. The divine vision had faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the storm, clouds, and the continuing rain. But its impact remained in the form of her son's restored life and her own renewed faith in the possibility of miracles. "You fell from the log, Mio, and I came in after you," Aina explained, her voice shaking with emotion and exhaustion. "But you're going to be okay now. Help is coming, and we're going to get out of this water together." The rescue team had finally reached the section of riverbank where Aina and Miguel clung to the tree branch. Father Martinez's voice carried clearly across the water as he coordinated the efforts to get them safely to shore. Ropes were thrown, emergency equipment was positioned, and within minutes both Aina and Miguel were being pulled from the river's grasp by the strong hands of their community members. Miguel was conscious but weak, shivering from cold and shock as he was wrapped in emergency blankets and checked by the paramedics who had been standing by during the search. Aina refused medical attention until she was certain that Miguel was stable and safe, her mother's instincts prioritizing his welfare over her own exhaustion and the various injuries she had sustained during their time in the dangerous water. "Did you see her too?" Miguel asked quietly as they sat together in the back of the ambulance, his voice so low that only Aina could hear the question. Aina's breath caught in her throat as she realized that Miguel might have witnessed the same divine vision that had appeared to her in their moment of greatest need. "See who, Mio?" "The lady in the blue dress," Miguel replied, his eyes wide with the memory. "She was floating above us, and she looked just like the statue Grandma Elena left you. When I saw her, I wasn't scared anymore, and then I could breathe again." Aina's heart raced as she processed Miguel's words. The vision hadn't been a hallucination born of desperation. It had been a genuine divine intervention witnessed by both mother and son, a miracle that had saved Miguel's life when medical intervention wouldn't have been possible. She pulled him closer, overwhelmed by gratitude and awe at what they had experienced together. The community members who had participated in the rescue gathered around the ambulance, their faces showing relief and joy at the successful outcome of what had seemed like a hopeless situation. Father Martinez approached Aina with tears in his eyes, clasping her hands and offering a silent prayer of thanksgiving for their safety. "Miracles still happen," the priest whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "God's grace finds a way to reach us even in our darkest moments." Aina nodded, knowing that she would never speak publicly about the vision she and Miguel had shared above the rushing water. Their faith didn't require external validation or community recognition. It was complete and sufficient in itself, strengthened rather than diminished by the miraculous intervention they had witnessed. The Virgin Mary had appeared in their moment of greatest need, and that divine presence would remain a private source of comfort and confidence for the rest of their lives. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Aina stood in the kitchen of their rebuilt home, morning sunlight streaming through new windows and illuminating the repaired Virgin Mary statue that occupied its place of honor on the mantelpiece. The small golden figure bore a hairline crack along one side where the floodwater had damaged it, but rather than detracting from its beauty, the imperfections seemed to catch the light in ways that made the statue appear even more radiant than before. The crack ran from the Virgin's left shoulder down to the base of her robes, a permanent reminder of the trials they had endured and the miracle they had witnessed. Aina had considered having the statue professionally repaired, but something about the visible damage felt appropriate. Their faith had been cracked by hardship, but made stronger rather than weaker by the experience. Like the statue, they bore the marks of their trials while maintaining their essential beauty and purpose. Miguel emerged from his bedroom, dressed for school and carrying his backpack with the easy confidence of a child who had faced his greatest fears and discovered that he was stronger than he had imagined. The nightmares about water had stopped weeks ago, replaced by a quiet respect for the river that no longer carried the obsessive fascination that had driven him to such dangerous behavior. He had learned to honor his father's memory through safer means, helping Aina in her sewing business, volunteering at the church, and taking care of the new chickens they had acquired to replace the ones lost in the flood. "Good morning, Mama," Miguel said, kissing Aina's cheek before sitting down to the breakfast she had prepared. "Mrs. Rodriguez said she might have more embroidery work for you today. Her granddaughter is getting married next spring, and she wants you to make the wedding dress." Aina smiled at the news, grateful for the steady growth of her sewing business as the community rebuilt and life returned to something approaching normalcy. The insurance settlement and community donations had allowed her to purchase new equipment, and her reputation for quality work had brought customers from neighboring towns who had heard about her skill with traditional garments. More importantly, the work gave her a sense of purpose and independence that helped her face the future with confidence rather than fear. Father Martinez joined them for breakfast, as he had done every Sunday since their rescue from the river. The elderly priest had become even more like family since that terrible night, offering both spiritual guidance and practical support as they navigated the complex process of rebuilding their lives. His presence at their table felt natural and comforting, a reminder that they were part of a larger community that cared about their welfare. "How are you feeling about school these days, Miguel?" Father Martinez asked, spreading jam on his toast, with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to savor simple pleasures. "Much better," Miguel replied honestly. "I like my new teacher, and I've been helping some of the younger kids with their reading. It makes me feel good to help other people learn things." Aina felt a surge of pride at her son's words, recognizing Roberto's generous spirit and Miguel's natural inclination to help others. The trauma of the flood and their near-drowning experience had initially made Miguel withdrawn and fearful, but over time it had seemed to deepen his empathy and strengthen his desire to contribute positively to his community. He was growing into the kind of man Roberto would have been proud to see. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Aina opened it to find Mrs. Hernandez holding a casserole dish and wearing the slightly embarrassed expression of someone who wanted to help but wasn't sure if her assistance was needed or welcome. "I made too much arroz con pollo last night," Mrs. Hernandez said, offering the dish to Aina. "I thought you might be able to use it for lunch or dinner." Aina accepted the casserole with gratitude, knowing that Mrs. Hernandez's kindness was part of the web of mutual support that had helped their community heal from the flood's devastation. These small gestures of care had become the foundation upon which San Gabriel was rebuilding itself, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. After Mrs. Hernandez left, Aina, Miguel, and Father Martinez walked together to Sunday Mass, following the same route they had taken for months, but now with hearts lightened by the knowledge that they had survived their greatest trial and emerged stronger. The church had been repaired and improved since the flood, its familiar sanctuary restored but enhanced with new stained glass windows donated by neighboring parishes who had supported San Gabriel's recovery efforts. During the service, Aina held the Virgin Mary statue in her hands as she had done every Sunday since childhood. But now the ritual carried deeper meaning than ever before. The statue was no longer just a symbol of inherited faith. It was a tangible reminder of divine intervention experienced firsthand, of prayers answered in the most desperate hour, of a miracle that required no external validation because it lived in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Miguel sang the hymns with genuine joy, his clear voice joining the chorus of their community in praise and thanksgiving. Ana watched him from the corner of her eye, marveling at his resilience and the grace with which he had processed their shared trauma. The boy who had once sought dangerous connection with his father's memory through proximity to the river had found healthier ways to honor Roberto's legacy through service, kindness, and faith. After Mass, they lingered in the church courtyard longer than usual, enjoying the warm sunshine and the comfortable fellowship of neighbors who had become even closer through their shared experience of loss and recovery. Children played among the orange trees while adults discussed plans for the upcoming harvest festival, the first major celebration San Gabriel had attempted since the flood. Miguel ran off to play with his friends, but he stayed within Ana's sight and avoided the areas near the river that had once drawn him with such dangerous fascination. His relationship with water had been transformed from obsession to respect, and he now understood the difference between honoring memory and courting disaster. Ana watched him laugh with the other children and felt Roberto's presence in a way that was comforting rather than painful, as if her late husband was pleased with how their son was growing into his own person. That evening, as they prepared for bed in their rebuilt home, Ana and Miguel knelt together before the Virgin Mary statue for their nightly prayers. The familiar ritual had taken on new depth since their experience in the river, each word carrying the weight of gratitude for life preserved and faith confirmed through direct experience of divine grace. "Mama," Miguel said quietly as they finished their prayers, "do you think Papa knows about what happened to us in the river?" Ana considered the question carefully, touched by Miguel's ongoing process of understanding the connections between earthly life and whatever existence awaited beyond death. "I think he knows that we're safe and that we love each other and that we're living the kind of life he would want for us." Miguel nodded, satisfied with her answer. "I think the lady in the blue dress was sent by Papa to take care of us when he couldn't do it himself." Ana's heart swelled with love for her son's innocent wisdom, recognizing the truth in his simple interpretation of their miraculous experience. Whether the Virgin Mary had appeared through Roberto's intercession or through her own divine compassion mattered less than the fact that they had been saved, protected, and strengthened through their trial. As Miguel settled into his bed, Ana stood for a moment in his doorway, watching him sleep and offering a silent prayer of thanksgiving for the gift of her son's continued presence in her life. The Virgin Mary statue caught the moonlight from the kitchen, its cracked surface seeming to glow with the same ethereal radiance they had witnessed above the rushing water on that terrible and wonderful night. Outside, the river sang its ancient song, but now Ana heard it differently, not as a threat or a source of grief, but as part of the natural rhythm that connected their small community to forces larger than themselves. The water that had once brought destruction had also brought revelation, washing away their old certainties and replacing them with a faith that was deeper, stronger, and more personal than anything they had known before. San Gabriel continued its patient recovery under the stars, its people sleeping peacefully in homes rebuilt with determination and supported by community love. Ana fell asleep to the familiar sound of flowing water, confident that whatever challenges the future might bring, she and Miguel would face them together, protected by the same divine grace that had carried them through their darkest hour and into the light of a new beginning.